He was voted Variety Entertainer of the Year in the Excellence in the Arts Awards. He is the voice of logic and reason. Now, from the entertainment capital of the world, Doug Basham.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again and welcome again to the show. My name is Doug Basham. That's also my website, DougBasham.com. That's also how you get a hold of me, Doug at DougBasham.com. Now, for those who may be watching for the first time, I am a former singer and keyboardist, a former magician, and after that, for several years, the only liberal progressive talk radio host here in Las Vegas. And now this? I mean, does it get any better? And FYI, my website is where I house the audio archives of my radio show. But if you look at the menu right at the top of the page, you will find the links to both my Facebook and Twitter pages, on both of which I am exceedingly active. Again, the website is DougBasham.com. Now, for those who watched our first show on this network, you will notice that I was able to whip off a shave before this show, as opposed to last show when I was not. And I'd like to begin today with some breaking news, if I may. First, we learned this week that President Joe Biden's beloved German Shepherd Champ passed away at the age of 13. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I much prefer a president who loves animals as opposed to one whose sons like killing them just for fun. Yeah, I'm old school that way. And speaking of animals and getting back to dogs, then there's Texas Governor Greg Abbott. And I think MSNBC's Brian Williams delivered just the right report on it.
Last thing before we go tonight, if you're a Trump or Republican, there's really no limit to what you can say to fire up the base. You can gaslight with the best of them. You can lie with impunity. Generally, the rule is say or do the most shocking thing imaginable, and that's how you stay on brand. Which brings us somehow back to the rootin' tootin' Trumper governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. His state doesn't have a dependable power grid, and yet he's going to build his own wall on the border, and he's being richly rewarded by a visit from his guy Trump next week. If Abbott wants to, say, run for president, he must be more further ensconced in a particular area of Trump's anatomy than even Ron DeSantis of Florida, and that won't be easy. Sure, the pretend outrage over critical race theory helps Abbott. So does the voter suppression bill he's been working so hard to enact, and that Guns for Everyone legislation he signed. But now he's outdone even himself. Today, and we quote here from the Texas Tribune, he vetoed a bill known as the Safe Outdoor Dogs Act. The bill would have made it illegal, and if you've ever loved a dog, this will appear to you to be common sense. It would have made it illegal to chain up dogs and leave them outside without drinkable water, adequate shade, or shelter. It also called for a ban on tethering dogs with heavy chains. Quote, Texas is no place for this kind of micromanaging and over-criminalization, said the governor in the veto statement. That goes right to the base, or at least it's designed to. Now tonight, the hashtag Abbott hates dogs is trending. Remember the rules when you're trying to appeal to that Trump base. Nothing can be shocking or outrageous enough, because Abbott figures apparently dogs can't vote. And really, what have dogs ever done for us? The latest news from Texas to take us off the air tonight. That is our broadcast for this Tuesday evening, with our thanks for being here with us.
I mean, even Ted Cruz left his dog inside his house when he abandoned his freezing Texas constituents for Cancun. And Ted Cruz is an asshole. Seriously. As someone once said, there are two kinds of people in this world: those who hate Ted Cruz and Ted Cruz. Remember what Lindsey Graham said back in 2016? And if you listen to the very first thing he said, he was and is equally correct on that.
How could that be? My party has gone bat crazy. A good Republican would defend Ted Cruz after tonight. That ain't happening. If you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate, and the trial was in the Senate, nobody could convict you.
And here's a headline you don't see every day, complete with discomfiting photo. Quote, Manhattan City Council candidate caught with dominatrix in leaked video. End quote. This guy's name, I kid you not, is Zach Weiner. It's right there in the story, not making anything up. They say he was caught with the dominatrix, gagged and enjoying a sadomasochism session. Well, who among us hasn't? But that aside, I'm still tempted to question the use of the word caught. Now, granted, going to a dominatrix isn't everybody's thing, but if it's yours and whatever happens is consensual, what's the problem? I mean, you're basically visiting a more aggressive masseuse, right? Or at least so I've been told. And get this, you know who leaked the tape to the press? His campaign manager. And you know, I'll never forget the day my ex-wife bought herself a dominatrix outfit, although she called it a wedding dress. And did you know the dominatrixes are famous for getting a great night's sleep? Oh yeah, they just love to hit the sack. I met a Russian dom once. Her name was Ivana Stepanyadik. At least, I think that's how you pronounce it. Here's Stephen Colbert.
Now, you may not have heard of Zach before, but his father is a co-creator of the popular children's television show Dora the Explorer, whereas his son created the less popular spinoff Marion the Disciplinarian.
And here's another headline, even stranger than that last one. Quote, man admitted to hospital with 25 plastic toy horses in rectum. End quote. Rectum, it damn near killed him. The good news is, doctors described the man's condition as stable. And speaking of headlines, remember this Trump-supporting insurrectionist Richard Barnett? The guy who broke into Nancy Pelosi's office, put his feet on her desk, and then left her a vulgar note wherein he called her a word that rhymes with bitch? Tell me if this headline doesn't just scream white privilege on steroids. Quote, Capitol rioter Richard Barnett, who put feet on Pelosi's desk, seeks freedom to attend car show? Now, the judge denied his request, but the balls to even ask. That's nuts. And it reminds me of the guy who went to see his doctor because his testicles were the size of beach balls. The doctor took one look at him and said, I know what your problem is. You're half nuts. Now, in all fairness, attending car shows was the freedom upon which our founding fathers founded this great nation. And they took that directly from the Bible, as I'm sure you self-professed Christians already know. I mean, if you read past the gun part in the Second Amendment, it's right there. And by the way, guess where this mook Richard Barnett appeared prior to the Biden-Putin summit? Yep, Russian state television, whereupon he was hailed as both, quote, a colorful character and an American patriot who, wait for it, protested the stolen election, end quote. Russian state media repeating Trump and his media's propaganda. And guess who else found themselves being praised on Russian TV? Why, Fox News, of course. Which brings us to that mother Tucker Carlson. This is what he barfed up recently.
Vladimir Putin knows authoritarian systems very well, and he sees clearly what is happening in this country. Watch this.
Did you order Alexei Navalny's assassination?
Of course not. We don't have this kind of habit of assassinating anybody. That's one. Number two is, I want to ask you, did you order the assassination of the woman who walked into the Congress and who was shot and killed by a policeman? Do you know that 450 individuals were arrested after entering the Congress, and they didn't go there to steal a laptop. They came with political demands.
Okay, so yeah, we just played tape of Vladimir Putin. Now, under normal circumstances, we would never play tape of a foreign adversary criticizing our government. But honestly, those are fair questions.
And of course, he's praising Putin for what he said. Why? Because Carlson had already said it. And you Trumpers know I'm telling you the truth. You heard these exact same words on Fox for weeks before Putin regurgitated them. Julia Davis is a wonderful journalist whose only beat is monitoring Russian state media. Her latest column for the Daily Beast carried the headline, quote, How Putin Made a Fool of Tucker Carlson, again by Julia Davis. And this goes with what I just said, Trump's state-run propaganda ministry providing Russian media with talking points and lies, which we're going to address more when we get to President Biden's overseas trip. But I gotta say, when Vladimir Putin starts repeating the same talking points / lies as the top-rated host on you Trumpers' network of choice, that ain't nothing to be proud of, or at least it wasn't until members of Trump's brain-dead base started dressing like this. I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat. And you know, there's a word for people like that, traitors, pure and simple, and shame on them. And that's even before we get to Carlson's idiocy, wherein he accused the FBI of planning and executing the insurrection. Seriously. But here's the relevant question. As we learn more about who's being arrested, and more importantly, with whom they were coordinating, do you see what Carlson's really doing here? He's trying to discredit the FBI. So if and when they ever get around to prosecuting the inciters of the insurrection, as in Mo Brooks, Paul Gosar, Andy Biggs, and the inciter-in-chief Donald Trump himself, Fox's audience will just say, it's not true. The FBI is corrupt, and it was really they who planned this attack. Again, there is no bottom with Donald Trump, his media, his congressional whores, or his diehard brain-dead base. They will attack anyone, be it our men and women in blue or our men and women in uniform, in order to protect the biggest criminal to ever rise to high office, Donald friggin' Trump. Last show, I played this clip from CNN's Jim Acosta, wherein he gave the most apt description of Fox News I've heard of late. There's a reason I'm playing it again this show.
The bullshit factory, also known as Fox News.
Acosta followed up on that comment this week.
You recall I recently described Fox News as the bullshit factory in honor of its steady stream of bogus segments aimed at ginning up viewer outrage. But Tucker has really outdone himself this week. So I've decided to award Tucker with the distinction of Bullshit Factory Employee of the Month. Congrats, Tucker. You did it. Nobody bullshits like you when it comes to the insurrection.
And did you see the results of the latest Economist/YouGov poll? 18% of Republicans had a favorable view of Putin, while only 14% had a similar view of their own president, Joe Biden. Similarly, 62% of Republicans had an unfavorable view on Putin, but 82% of Republicans saw Joe Biden in a negative light. And guess who couldn't wait to both broadcast and spread this news? Russian state media, of course. Just 3 words: shame on you. If you had any integrity or decency or patriotism, you would hang your heads in shame. Just shame on you. And if you look at who the reporter is on that story and for whom he works, Alexei Nikolsky, TASS. Since 1904, TASS has been the #1 Russian news agency and the largest. They have 70 offices in Russia and 68 around the world, including one right here in America. In other news, yet another G7 and NATO summit are over. The trip began with the President and First Lady visiting with the Queen. And look, I was born in Canada. I consider myself to be a half-Brit, which is not to be confused with half-wit. But when I was a little boy and I went to school, the very first thing we did every morning before we did anything else was sing God Save the Queen. I know my Queen. This is not a forced or phony smile. This is genuine. You know, as opposed to this, which I can assure you took some effort on Her Majesty's behalf. And for those who don't know, Queen Elizabeth served her country honorably in World War II. No bone spurs had she. When then Princess Elizabeth turned 18 in 1944, she insisted upon joining the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. Eventually, she was promoted to junior commander, our equivalent of captain. And if I may be so bold as to say this about my queen, back in the day before the princess became queen, she was a babe. Seriously. And here she is with Prince Philip in his dapper days. The breaking news is Joe Biden didn't embarrass or disgrace this nation overseas, contrary to what Donald Trump's state-run propaganda ministry keeps telling you. They, of course, had to immediately and hypocritically start majoring in the minors and attack Joe Biden for just the multitude of gaffes he made during this trip. You know, because Donald Trump never made any gaffes, did he?
I like people that weren't captured, okay?
I was down there, and I watched our police and our firemen down on 7-Eleven, down at the World Trade Center right after it came down.
Look at what happened in the 1990s. Our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and this was a horrible period of time for us, were attacked.
You know what uranium is, right? It's a thing called nuclear weapons and other things, like lots of things are done with uranium, including some bad things.
And I will tell you, I left Texas, and I left Florida, and I left Louisiana, and I went to Puerto Rico, and I met with the president of the Virgin Islands.
The latest act of resistance
Is the op-ed published in the failing New York Times by an anonymous, really an anonymous, gutless coward.
The wall, the barrier, whatever you want to call it, it's okay with me. They can name it whatever they can name it, peaches. A few weeks ago, on January 23rd, Venezuela's National Assembly, they are risking their future, they are risking their lives, and Venezuela's future.
You've really put a big investment in our country. We appreciate it very much, Tim Apple.
I hope they now go and take a look at the oranges of the
investigation, the beginnings. In June of 1775, the Continental Congress created a unified army out of the revolutionary forces encamped around Boston and New York, and named after the great George Washington, Commander-in-Chief. Our army manned the air, it ran the ramparts, it took over the airports, it did everything it had to do. The kidney has a very special place in the heart. It's an incredible thing. In addition, up to 11,000 more Americans could receive heart, lung, and liver transplants annually. He was awarded the Bronze Star and the Combat Infantryman Badge for his service. Open wounds cannot heal if we are divided. We must seek real bipartisan solutions. This is the very definition of totalitarianism. When they gaze upon Yosemite's towering sequoias, their love of country grows stronger, and they know that every American has truly a duty to preserve this wondrous inheritance and to avoid liability, shifting production to Thailand and to Vietnam. I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid, right? There is none.
Donald Trump has this other thing he does, wherein after he mispronounces a word, instead of correcting himself, he says, and then he says the correct word as if he meant to say both words, even when the first word he said mistakenly makes no sense in the context of what he meant to say.
Let us rethink old assumptions and open our hearts and minds to possible and possibilities as they struggle to reclaim their religious and righteous destiny. But despite reported and repeated warnings, tolerance for human struggling and human smuggling and trafficking is not humane. He goes by DJ and CJ. He said, call me either one. And has instead given unelected regulators and regulators, we will arrive at a peace and a place. They work 2 jobs and sometimes 3 jobs. They sacrifice every day for the furniture and future of their children. Authority and authoritarian powers through their lives, and though their lives were cut short. Our hope is a word and world of proud, independent nations. What standard? And really, if you think of it, when you talk about the great sailors and the great sailors of the world, we have them. But what stranded sailor doesn't feel relief?
Now, did Joe Biden make some gaffes? Of course he did. It's no secret Biden does that from time to time, just like Trump, just like everybody who speaks frequently in public. I'm not sure this one, however, was really a gaffe, and neither was Stephen Colbert.
I caught part of President Putin's press conference.
Hey, he mixed them up. Oh. Though I gotta say, it was often hard to tell the difference.
But as Biden himself would say, here's the deal. Many, if not most, of the 81 million people who made Joe Biden our 46th president, we knew that going in, and we didn't care. You know why? Because Joe Biden is not a lazy, incompetent charlatan who's not qualified for any office, let alone the highest in the land. Joe Biden is not a chronic, pathological serial liar, nor is he a malignant narcissist and an insufferable braggart with a gigantic yet fragile ego. He's also not a lifelong con man, grifter, snake oil salesman, and cheat, nor is he a disturbed demagogue and sociopath who was only ever capable of caring for himself and himself alone, and thus has to make everything about himself. And most importantly, Joe Biden respects the norms and institutions that have allowed this democracy to survive for over 200 years. He is not an authoritarian dictator wannabe with no respect for the rule of law or our democratic form of government. Joe Biden is not a lifelong criminal who is desperate to stay in office and out of jail, and therefore Biden is not a clear and present danger and threat to our democratic republic. Donald Trump, on the other hand, was and still is. And all this talk from Trump's media that Joe Biden simply isn't up to the job. This one brief response to a reporter in Geneva exposed that accusation for the lie it is.
And now that you've talked to him, do you believe you can trust him?
Look, this is not about trust. This is about self-interest and verification of self-interest. That's what it's about. So I virtually almost anyone that I would work out an agreement with that affected the American people's interest, I don't say, well, I trust you, no problem. Let's see what happens. You know, as that old expression goes, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. We're going to know shortly.
Just a common sense, honest, and reality-based response, and one that shows Biden's experience in the realm of politics and reality. Here's another one.
What is going to happen next is we're going to be able to look back, look ahead in 3 to 6 months and say, did the things we agreed to sit down and try to work out, did it work? Are we closer to a major strategic stability talks and progress? Are we further along in terms of and go down the line? That's going to be the test. I'm not sitting here saying because the president and I agreed that we would do these things that all of a sudden it's going to work. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I think there's a genuine prospect to significantly improve the relations between our two countries without us giving up a single solitary thing based on principle and our values.
And you know, I'll spare you the comparison by not playing the clip wherein Trump acquiesced to Vladimir Putin in Helsinki and took Putin's word over his own country's. I played that last week. That was the day Trump exposed what MAGA really stands for: Make America Grovel Again. But then there were other instances, like this one, wherein real-world leaders laughed at Trump and his empty bullcrap bragging.
Today I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
And then there was this incident wherein real-world leaders mocked Trump in his absence, including Boris Johnson, who many call Britain's Trump. And then there was the shove seen round the world. Who does that? What kind of person would shove the leader of another country, in this case, the Prime Minister of Montenegro, out of the way, then flip his suit jacket like a proud peacock as if he'd just done something worthy of admiration, just so his delusional, self-important ass could be front and center for a photo? Answer: an ignorant, sorry, and pathetic excuse for a human being with no class, and worse, no shame. with a highly over-exaggerated and completely unwarranted sense of self. The same kind of guy who on September the 11th, 2001, bragged that his building at 40 Wall Street was now the tallest building in Manhattan.
Donald, you have one of the landmark buildings down in the financial district, 40 Wall Street. Did you have any damage, or did you know what's happened down there?
Well, it was an amazing phone call I made. 40 Wall Street actually was the second tallest building in downtown Manhattan, and it was actually, before the World Trade Center, was the tallest. And then when they built the World Trade Center, it became known as the second tallest, and now it's the tallest.
This is the same guy who said he lost hundreds of friends on 9/11 and yet didn't attend even one single solitary funeral. The same guy who tweeted on the anniversary of 9/11 in 2013, quote, "I would like to extend my best wishes to all, even the haters and losers, on this special date, September the 11th, end quote. And this was yet one of countless instances that told you all you needed to know about Donald Trump and what a garbage human being he is. And if a tweet like this doesn't disgust you down to the very marrow in your bones, and you can still bring yourself to say, this guy should still be our president, there is something seriously wrong with you. Seriously wrong. But back to the shove. That was yet another mortifyingly embarrassing and humiliating moment for America. And yet, in fairness, that's who Donald Trump is. He simply doesn't know any better. Or he does and just doesn't care, which is worse. But the fact that his equally classless base was not disgusted and ashamed by this display and so many others, like that 9/11 tweet, or his mocking of a disabled person, or his trashing of POWs, or his over 30,500 lies in the 4 years he squatted in the White House, or the deaths of hundreds of thousands of your fellow Americans who died needlessly because of Donald Trump's genocidal response to the coronavirus. That tells you more about them than it does Donald Trump. But make no mistake, Donald Trump knows exactly who his base is.
We won with highly educated. We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated.
And did you hear the latest? Remember in the early days of the virus when Trump wanted to leave Americans who had been infected with the virus on that cruise ship off California?
Has a decision been made?
It's a very good question. If they would like to have the people come off, I'd rather have the people stay, but I'd go with them. I told them to make the final decision. I would rather, because I like the numbers being where they are. I don't need to have the numbers double because of one ship. That wasn't our fault. And it wasn't the fault of the people on the ship either. Okay? It wasn't their fault either. And they're mostly Americans, so I can live either way with it. I'd rather have them stay on, personally.
Yep, they weren't sick Americans. They were nothing but numbers. Numbers Trump feared would make him look bad. Well, we learned this week that around the same time as this cruise ship travesty was occurring, Trump mused about sending infected American citizens to Guantanamo Bay. You know, the place we hold suspected terrorists. Why? Again, to suppress the numbers. Because that's all he saw Americans as, numbers. And numbers that either made him look good or didn't. But yeah, we need this guy as our president again. Can't wait for August. Idiots. It would behoove anyone who is still harboring under the dishonest delusion that Donald Trump is their champion and actually cares about them and loves this country. It would behoove you to remember the words of someone who knows Trump better than any of us, Howard Stern.
The oddity in all of this is the people Trump despises most love him the most. Think about it. The people who are voting for Trump, for the most part,
They're not people he wants.
Oh my God, he wouldn't even let him in a hotel. He'd be disgusted with them. He doesn't want it. You go look at Mar-a-Lago, see if there's any people that look like you. I'm talking to you in the audience. The Trump voter who, idolizes the guy. He despises you. Despises you. You're someone to grab by the pussy if you're hot. I know Donald. I know him very well. And I don't hate Donald. I hate you for voting for him. I don't hate Donald. Donald's doing his thing. I hate you for voting for him, for not having an intelligence, for not able to see what's going on with the coronavirus, not able to see what the Justice Department is doing. I hate you. I don't want you here. I want to build a wall and throw you the out. I do. I'm for a wall. Not for the Mexicans. For you. That's how I feel. Now, don't call me and start arguing with me. Howard, you're a jerk. You're a libtard or whatever it is you call it. I ain't no libtard. Trust me.
I thought late-night host Stephen Colbert summed up Biden's meeting with Putin appropriately.
Something Arctic. Basically, the only thing that was exciting about it is that this time it was not the most demoralizing, nauseating, international bootlicking anyone has ever seen. No. The Boniva in Geneva didn't have to clear a very high bar. It just had to be less embarrassing than the Stinky in Helsinki.
And before we leave this year's G7 and NATO summits, anyone notice how different Vladimir Putin acted meeting a real American president and not one of his assets who just played a president on TV? It appeared Putin left his swag at home this time. He wasn't the cocky peacock he was in Helsinki. Absent was the ever-present smirk. In fact, he looked physically uncomfortable, especially when asked this question by ABC's Rachel Scott.
If I may, sir, the list of your political opponents who are dead, imprisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption. But Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Damn, that was badass. This Rachel Scott swings a long sword, doesn't she? This is what is commonly known as a mic drop moment. Rachel Scott's got more balls than Donald Trump and the entire QOP combined. I would, however, advise Ms. Scott to immediately hire a taste tester and not touch any doorknobs, say, for the rest of her life. Stephen Colbert put it this way.
So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Wow. Man. That was great. She will be missed.
Now let's listen to Putin's response, or non-response, as it turned out. Because after that question, which was the shot heard round the world, Putin didn't answer it. Instead, he resorted to the same two tactics Trump's state-run propaganda ministry does every time something happens they can't defend, which is often. 1, whataboutism, and 2, false equivalence. And so Putin brings up, of all things, George Floyd, but more specifically, exactly like Trump's state-run propaganda ministry does, the George Floyd protests.
So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
The organization that you mentioned has publicly called for a mass disorder. They have publicly called for breaking the law. America just recently had very severe events after well-known events after the killing of an African American. And an entire movement developed known as Black Lives Matter. What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc. We feel sympathy for the United States of America, but we don't want that to happen on our territory.
And you know, there was zero difference between watching that non-response from Putin and watching Fox News at night. But did you notice? Putin did the whataboutism false equivalence fandango, but he didn't answer the question, something of which ABC's Rachel Scott immediately informed Putin, and she asked it again. And as a result, Putin stuttered and stammered before he avoided answering her question again.
You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
Значит, по поводу того, кого убьют или...
Did you notice? Before he even began to speak, Putin cleared his throat, and then after he uttered a few words, he cleared it again. There was nothing wrong with his voice. He was just fighting the urge to scream, "Kill her!" And so, after he had sufficiently cleared his throat and realizing his George Floyd false equivalence missed the mark, Putin decided to invoke the January 6th insurrection false equivalence, as in the prosecution of insurrectionists and domestic terrorists is exactly the same as killing your political enemies. And so, just to throw Trump's base even more red meat, Putin even referenced the shooting of Ashley Babbitt. Seriously.
All right, about my opponents being jailed or imprisoned. People went into U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people are now facing criminal charges. They are facing prison terms of up to 20 or maybe 25 years. They are called homegrown terrorists. One of the participants, a woman, was shot dead on the spot. She was not threatening with, with arms or anything. Why am I bringing this up? Many people are facing the same things as we do.
Whataboutism and false equivalences, something legitimate President Biden was quick to point out during his press conference.
That's a ridiculous comparison. It's one thing for literally criminals to break through cordon, go into the Capitol, kill a police officer, and be held unaccountable. And it is for people objecting and marching on the Capitol and saying, you are not allowing me to speak freely.
And have you noticed, when it's a black person, the right says, oh, they should have complied with the cops' instructions. But when it's a white person, in this case, Ashley Babbitt, oh, she was executed. Maybe she should have complied. She was given fair warning. Even her own peeps were telling her the cop had a gun. These domestic terrorists had already breached police barriers. They were rampaging through the Capitol, yelling, "Kill the mother effers and hang Mike Pence," with a gallows set up outside. They were threatening other members of Congress, breaking windows, kicking doors open, jabbing cops in the eye with flagpoles, beating other cops with hockey sticks. This is the same scenario of an intruder breaking into your home. If you saw an intruder coming in through one of your windows and you were standing there armed, what would you do? According to the right, you would have every right to shoot the intruder. Ashley Babbitt was an intruder. What was the cop supposed to do? Let her come through the window followed by others? It was hundreds against a few. They were threatening to murder members of Congress. If lethal force wasn't appropriate at that point, you tell me when it would have been. No, seriously, tell me. There's my email address. And it worked. No one else tried to get into that room, and no excuses should be offered for these seditionists, insurrectionists. And please, tell me you are not stupid enough to actually believe Vladimir Putin gives a continental rat's ass about Ashley Babbitt? If she had tried what she did here in another country, say one with a government more like Russia's than ours, firstly, the whole damn lot of them would have been dragged out into the middle of a field along with their families, all shot on the spot, and their bodies shoved into a ditch. I'd like to see any one of them try what they did here on January 6th in Russia. And this cry from the right to learn the name of the officer who shot and killed Ashley Babbitt, why do you think that's so important to them? What will change once they do know his identity? I'll tell you, the safety of that officer and his family. That's why they want to know who he is. These people don't care any more about Ashley Babbitt than they did the 4 who died in Benghazi. They used their dead bodies as political footballs they kicked up and down the field, first to try and stop Obama's reelection, and when that failed, to try and prevent Hillary Clinton from running for president. And by the way, a bipartisan investigation would answer all these questions the right is demanding to know. Problem is, Republicans voted no to that. Again, not because they don't want to know what happened that day, but rather because they do know what happened. And here's a question. Where do you think Putin got the false equivalences he just used? You Trump supporters nowhere. From Donald Trump's state-run propaganda ministry. This is what you have been watching and listening to for months following the January 6th insurrection, which we're going to dive into momentarily. This is what you have been watching and listening to for years. Whataboutism and false equivalences. And I got to tell you, when a dictator of an enemy country starts parroting the same media you patronize, it is time for some serious self-reflection and some honest examination of the life, political, and media choices you've made. And just for the record, I am on record on countless episodes of my radio show calling for Fox Noise to be removed from the airwaves, and more recently, Newsmax and OAN. They are not news networks. They are propaganda industrial complexes, so much so that the dictator Putin is now repeating them verbatim on the world stage. That makes all 3 of them, Fox, Newsmax, and OAN, along with the totality of right-wing hate radio, all of them, clear and present dangers and existential threats, not just to the security of our nation, but to the survival of our very democracy. And I'm sorry, I wouldn't have to call for them to be removed if some people were just a little smarter. But if that were the case, Donald Trump never would have become our so-called president. And that existential threat is something we're just not going to focus on in this show, but pretty much every show we do from this point on. I told you last show that we were going to turn our attention to first the January 6th insurrection, and then what we real-world dwellers recognize as the ongoing insurrection endeavors, aka voter restriction laws and bogus recounts and audits, all of which are anti-American and anti-democracy attempts to legitimize Donald Trump's big lie that the election was rigged and stolen, a lie he began spewing months before the election was even held.
In New York and these different places. So we have to win the election. We can't play games. Get out and vote. Do those beautiful absentee ballots, or just make sure your vote gets counted. Make sure, because the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election. So we have to be very careful. It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election.
Which, of course, led to the horrific, deadly, and democracy-threatening January 6th insurrection, the history of which Trump himself, along with his media, his lickspittles in Congress, and his brainwashed and brain-dead base, have tried to rewrite ever since, beginning with just the very name of what happened that day, namely an insurrection. In fact, just recently, 21 Republican House members voted against awarding the Capitol Hill Police and the Metro D.C. Police gold medals for their valor on January 6th, including Machine Gun Marjorie 3 names. And what was Green's and others' excuse for not voting yes? she and they didn't like the fact that the word insurrection was used. Seriously, let's check a dictionary, shall we? In fact, several of them. And let's start with dictionary.com. It defines insurrection as an act or instance of rising in revolt, rebellion, or resistance against civil authority or an established government. Cambridge Dictionary, an organized attempt by a group of people to defeat their government and take control of their country, usually by violence. And you'll notice under that they have a special category for armed insurrection, which means you don't have to be armed to be classified as an insurrectionist. Which brings us to the definition of armed. You don't have to be armed with a firearm to be armed. For example, I come to this show each week armed with information, talent, and wit. And at least one of those three is true. In short, you don't have to be packing to be armed, although we learned this week that there were at least 3 insurrectionists who were indeed armed with firearms. One domestic terrorist, Guy Reffitt, came from Texas with an AR-15 and a .40 caliber handgun, and later threatened teens and told them that they reported him, he would shoot them. Merriam-Webster defines insurrection as an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government. Macmillan Dictionary, an attempt by a large group of people to take control of their country by force. Oxford Dictionary, a situation in which a large group of people try to take political control of their own country with violence. FreeDictionary.com, the act or instance of open revolt against civil authority or a constituted government. And finally, the Collins Dictionary. An insurrection is a violent action that is taken by a large group of people against the rulers of their country, usually in order to remove them from office. Hello! William Shakespeare once wrote, "What's in a name?" In this case, everything. In the real world, according to any dictionary you can lay your hands on, with perhaps the exception of the one they used at Trump University, what transpired on January 6th, oh hell yeah, was an insurrection. Just because you have allowed yourselves to be so brainwashed into believing a version of Donald Trump that simply doesn't exist, and thus have to make excuses for everything he says and does, you do not get to rewrite dictionary definitions. And there are countless liars who have done their part in trying to rewrite the history of January 6th. Today we're going to shine the spotlight of shame on 2 in particular, convicted felon Dinesh D'Souza and that mother Tucker Carlson. First, D'Souza. And I'd like you to hear this part of a conversation between D'Souza and a woman he used to date, Laura Ingraham, seen here realizing a Nazi salute may not be the best way to end your convention speech. And just like Donald Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich man and a weak person's idea of a strong man, Dinesh D'Souza is a stupid person's idea of a smart man. Oh yeah, the right considers him to be an intellectual. But before he did his rewrite of January 6th, D'Souza had to demonstrate just how low the right is willing to sink in order to demonize anyone whose real-life experiences exposes what they're trying to rewrite.
So what's going on here, you know, I just read and I had to kind of chuckle a little bit because hundreds of congressional members and staff are apparently in therapy over the events of January 6th. They're literally in counseling, even though not a single one of them apparently was harmed.
People were calling their loved ones, fearing they might be killed, who had endured an extremely traumatic experience that went on for hours. And when this putrid little snot finds out they're in therapy, he chuckles? He finds their trauma funny? Let me tell you something I have absolutely no proof of, but know to be as true as the day is long. Had Dinesh D'Souza been present at the Capitol that day, he'd have been crying for his mommy and needed a change of underwear. Seriously, it would have been code brown pants. Again, the right considers Dinesh D'Souza to be an intellectual. This convicted felon is nothing but a shallow and pretentious little internet troll and conspiracy theorist, as well as a self-loathing, law-breaking immigrant who wails against law-breaking immigrants. And if you're shocked at his lack of empathy for those in therapy after January 6th, don't be. This is par for the course. You know what this shabby little worm tweeted after the Parkland shooting in Florida that killed 17? Quote, "Worst news since their parents told them to get summer jobs." End quote. Sometimes there are no words. Oh wait, I have one. Prick. Complete and utter, unadulterated, undiluted, gold-plated prick. And this guy is a conservative hero. No wonder Republicans were drawn to Trump. It seems the more despicable and repulsive a leading conservative is, the more the QOP base gravitates towards them, as long as they control and trigger us libtards. And then D'Souza offered perhaps the most disgusting attempts at whitewashing January 6th I think I've heard of late.
So what you have here is the attempt to gin up, to create a wartime scenario with media propaganda, that sort of wartime propaganda to go along with it. Even during the impeachment, we saw all those concocted videos by the Democrats making this look like it was a scene out of Braveheart, but you had to doctor the videos to create the impression, because in reality, this was a bunch of rowdy people walking through hallways.
Rowdy people walking through the hallways. Remember that. Rowdy people walking through the hallways. To which that Mother Tucker Carlson, also on and of Fox Noise, said, "Hold my beer." Let's listen to his attempts to whitewash January 6th.
This weekend, another mob came to the home of what they thought belonged to one of the witnesses in Derek Chauvin's defense. They smeared pig blood all over the house. What do you call that? Well, it's textbook. It's witness intimidation. Fighting things like that, witness intimidation, is precisely why we have a civil rights division at the Justice Department, to protect people's civil rights, especially the right to speak freely at criminal trials. That's what due process is. Where was Joe Biden's DOJ today? Swarming the scene to protect the civil rights of everyone involved, to protect the legal system itself? Nope. Sorry. They were too busy rounding up more elderly poor people who made the mistake of stepping inside the Capitol on January 6th.
Elderly poor people who made the mistake of stepping inside the Capitol on January 6th. As for what Carlson led with, of course, smearing anything on a witness's house is wrong. But it's not an attempt to overturn a democratically held election, destroy its democracy, and overthrow the government of the United States. This is one of Trump's media's favorite go-to tools, the false equivalence. Here's another one.
It's almost hard to process facts like these. Calling for violence even as you demand that taxpayers protect you from the violence you're calling for. Whipping a dangerous mob into a frenzy at the very same moment you are trying to eliminate the police and then disarm the population through gun control. What is that? Well, it's totalitarian, and we should be honest about it. Too often, Republicans waste time highlighting the hypocrisy of the left. Is BLM more dangerous than the fake insurrectionists who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th? Well, yeah, obviously. Is Maxine Waters guilty of greater incitement than Donald Trump? Well, of course.
Is BLM more dangerous than the fake insurrectionists who showed up at the Capitol? No, they're not, because they weren't seditionists. I mean, whether you agree with BLM's cause or not one BLM protest was grounded in overturning an election. Same with Maxine Waters. If you want to argue the merits of her advising people to get up in the liars' faces and tell them they're not welcome, that's one thing. But what you cannot argue is that Waters was trying to incite an insurrection to overturn an election she lost. Again, another false equivalence. And here's one more.
This is the day that we pause to remember the white supremacist QAnon insurrection that came so very close to toppling our government and ending this democracy forever. A mob of older people from unfashionable zip codes somehow made it all the way to Washington, D.C., probably by bus. They wandered freely through the Capitol like it was their building or something. They didn't have guns, but a lot of them had extremely dangerous ideas. They talked about the Constitution and something called their rights. Neither Lisa Eisenhart nor her son damaged any property at the Capitol or committed any violence. They just walked in to what we used to refer to as the People's House. These are people whose crime was trespassing in the Capitol. We're not endorsing that, but some perspective.
Older people from unfashionable zip codes took buses to D.C. How would he know that? Answer, he wouldn't and doesn't. He's just lying. And then he says they wandered through the Capitol as if it were their building, which it wasn't and isn't, at least not for what they were there for. And again, we have since learned that some did indeed have guns, and what they were there for was as antithetical and hostile to our Constitution as could be. And did you hear Carlson snarkily say at the beginning, this is the day we pause to remember the white supremacist QAnon insurrection? On another show, he brought up the white supremacist element again, only expanded upon it.
So that should be the goal. That's our history, and we ought to get back to it as soon as we can. But that is exactly the opposite of what our leaders are doing. They're working hard to divide us into warring camps, and they're using lies to do it. They're telling us a story that is completely and very much intentionally disconnected from reality. They're claiming that something called white supremacy, and that's a term they never define, is the single greatest threat we face, a greater threat than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Here's our thoroughly craven Attorney General telling us that very lie today.
In the FBI's view, the top domestic violent extremist threat comes from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocated for the superiority of the white race.
All right, that's the Attorney General of the United States making a statement of fact backed up by the FBI. So it's fair to ask obvious questions. Who exactly are these violent white supremacists? What are their names? What crimes under the U.S. Code have they committed? We still don't know. Merrick Garland didn't tell us today. Instead, he spent most of his time talking about the riot at the Capitol on January 6th, an event that had nothing whatsoever to do with race. Nothing.
Firstly, I'm sorry. After defending Trump's last Attorney General, Bill Fubar, and Trump himself, and all of those who are attempting to overturn the election, you have willingly sacrificed the right to call anyone craven, least of all Merrick Garland. So far, I think he's the wrong man for the job, and I'm very disappointed in him. Now, I didn't expect him to act like the most corrupt AG in our history, Bill Fubar, but I was hoping for more than Richard Simmons. That said, Garland's actions thus far do not equate with being craven. Secondly, January 6th had nothing to do with white supremacy, and Garland lied when he said it did. I guess Carlson missed these shots on that day. As the fourth great-nephew of General Robert E. Lee, Reverend Robert Lee IV said, quote, "A flag of treasonous and seditionist movement entered our capital, and that was an attack on our democracy." End quote. I mean, I guess it should come as no surprise these right-wing bottom feeders were still flying Trump flags 2 months after they lost the election. They're still flying Confederate flags, and they lost that battle over 150 years ago. And I was thinking, it must be so hard to come to this country and learn English. For example, there's a silent K in the word night, as in golden night, 4 silent Ks in the word knickknack, and 3 silent Ks in the word Republican. And here's the offshoot of all these attempts to rewrite the history of January 6th and this trivializing of the insurrectionists that I haven't heard anybody else mention yet, namely, which of their other lies it exposes. And that lie is that the insurrectionists were really anti-Trumpers, BLM, and Antifa. Like I said last show, if the QOP truly thought that's who attacked our Capitol that day, number one, they wouldn't have voted against a bipartisan commission. Number two, you think they'd be trying to portray them as elderly people with credit card debt and just some tourists and rowdy people wandering through the hallways of the Capitol? Seriously? Don't make me call on Sam Elliott again. And for even more deceitful and dishonest rhetoric from Trump, his politicians, and his base, this is how the right has defended Trump from his incendiary remarks on January the 6th. They cite this one remark Trump drooled.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Which has led to Trump's acolytes in Congress seizing on that one singular remark and repeating it as if that were the only thing Trump said the morning of January 6th.
No, in fact, President Trump used the words peaceful when he talked about, the statements that he made.
Yeah, Steve, that's all he said. Tell you what, right now I would like you to listen to what else Trump said the morning of January 6th. And this is going to be an audio clip. I originally put this together for my radio show. I watched the entire speech, then went back and watched it again and made a collage of what else he said, but only audio because, again, it was for a radio show. And I'm sorry, but I just couldn't bring myself to watch it a third time just to bring you the video of him saying it. Sorry, I just couldn't. But here's what else he drooled that day.
We will stop the steal. We're going to have to fight much harder, and Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen. There's never been anything like this. It's a pure theft in American history. Everybody knows it. Make no mistake, this election was stolen from you, from me, and from the country. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness.
See what I mean? And now, after listening to Dinesh D'Souza and that mother Tucker Carlson tell you that January 6th was nothing more than fake insurrectionists and elderly people with credit card debt, just some tourists and rowdy people walking through the hallways of the Capitol, I would like you to now watch and listen to what truly happened that day, what we real-world dwellers aren't trying to ignore, move past, or rewrite. This is January 6th.
fucking million of us out there, and we are listening to Trump. You're the boss. Treason! Treason!
Where the fuck are they?
There's gotta be something in here we can fucking use against these scumbags.
That's what we fucking need to have 30,000 guns up here. Next trip. That's what we need. Let's go! Let's go! Take it! Take it out! Use the shield! Use the shield! Use the shield! We need fresh patriots abroad! Storm your own Capitol buildings and take down every one of these corrupt motherfuckers!
Yep, just a bunch of senior citizens and tourists with credit card debt, along with some rowdy people from unfashionable zip codes, just walking through the hallways of our Capitol. And did you notice? Nary a Trump supporter among them. Liars all. Here's the bottom line, folks. You simply cannot have a functioning and open society when conspiracy theories and lies are being used to radicalize people into carrying out acts of violence. You cannot have a functioning society when there is no longer a shared set of facts or a common truth. And it is way past time to hold the liars accountable. From Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, Mike Lindell, Steve Bannon, Mo Brooks, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Andy Biggs, Paul Gosar, Andrew Clyde, to the liar and thief himself, Donald Trump, and so many more. And I'll repeat something I said last show. If you can't yell fire in a crowded theater without consequences, how in the holy hell can you get away with lies and conspiracy theories that threaten to destroy our very democratic form of government by attacking the foundational bedrock of our democracy, free and fair elections? You can't. So stop trying. That's going to do it for today, folks. I thank you for watching. We will do it all over again next week, hopefully with you. Until then, take care, stay safe, and for God's sake, learn where you can obtain legitimate news and information and not lies and propaganda and conspiracy theories. Because for all the fake news gibberish uttered by the serial lying Trump, his liars in Congress, and his brain-dead base, fake news is exactly what they've chosen to patronize and believe, or at least act like they believe, and then use that belief or pretense as a justification for violence, thinking they're saving this country when all they're doing is destroying it. Food for thought. See you next time.